My father was a man sculpted long before I was born, shaped by expectations older than him, heavier than him, and stricter than the world I eventually grew up in. He belonged to a generation where survival mattered more than self-understanding, where vulnerability was treated like a dangerous luxury no one could afford. To him, emotions were not tools but weaknesses, and he carried that belief into every part of his life, including our home. He grew up in a time and place where men were defined by how well they endured, not by how openly they felt. Hardship was stitched into his childhood. Responsibility was handed to him before he was old enough to know what responsibility meant. When he became a father, he didn't know how to hold love gently. He only knew how to carry it like a weight he couldn't drop. Where he came from, silence was the language of strength. If fear gripped you, you buried it. If shame cornered you, you outworked it. If sadness visited, you locked the door and pretended you didn't hear the knocking. Generations of men before him had trained themselves to build emotional walls tall enough to keep everyone out, including the people they claimed to love. Our home became an extension of those beliefs. Controlled, disciplined, predictable, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, old habits he inherited without questioning. The structure of our family felt rigid, like it was built from stone rather than warmth. We rarely spoke about feelings because in his world, feelings were storms that could destroy foundations. Better to avoid them. There were rules in our home, not because he imposed them harshly, but because he didn't know any other way to live. Rules about how to behave. Rules about how to speak. Rules about emotions, especially the ones that made him uncomfortable. My father wasn't a bad man. He was a man carrying the blueprint of a past that didn't fit the present. But beneath that structured world lived cracks none of us knew how to name. There were quiet arguments behind closed doors, words whispered just a bit too sharply, hopes that remained unspoken because saying them aloud might expose disappointment. My parents carried the weight of these silent battles long before I understood their language. Financial struggles sat like a shadow at our dinner table. Money was always tight, always slipping away, always just out of reach of feeling enough. My father carried that pressure alone, or at least he tried to. He believed it was his role, his duty to hold everything together, even if it meant breaking himself in the process. But the irony was that the more he tried to hold everything together, the more he seemed to fall apart inside. Stress replaced softness. Worry replaced laughter. Duty replaced presence. He was physically there, but emotionally miles away. Trapped in a world of expectations he didn't know how to escape. Our family was caught between two eras, between tradition and transition. My father represented the old ways, where fathers worked silently and children obeyed without question. But the world around us was changing fast. Women were speaking out. Children were asking why. Emotions were no longer hidden. They were discussed, explored, validated. He didn't know how to adapt. Or maybe he didn't know he needed to. He lived in the space between the life he wanted and the life he ended up with, a life built on responsibilities he didn't choose, burdens he didn't voice, and dreams he quietly let go of. And instead of grieving those dreams, he buried them beneath harder work, longer hours, and deeper silence. There was always a sense of tension in him, a restlessness he tried to disguise with stern expressions and disciplined routines. But the cracks showed, sometimes in the way he sighed a little too deeply, sometimes in the way he stared out the window as if searching for a version of himself he never became, sometimes in the way he walked away from conversations, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. His decisions were shaped by the invisible weight of guilt for not earning enough, for not giving enough, for not being enough. Pride kept him from admitting any of it. Fear kept him locked in a cycle of emotional silence. And love, though present, never quite reached the surface. The older I get, the more I realize how much he struggled with the concept of being a father. He tried to model strength, but what he really modeled was fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of failure, fear of being seen too clearly. He never told us he loved us, though I believe he did. But love without expression is like a letter never delivered. It exists, but it never reaches its destination. Our house functioned like a machine, predictable, efficient, and emotionally disconnected. But even the strongest machines malfunction under too much pressure. The arguments between my parents grew more frequent, not explosive, but sharp, like tiny fractures weakening a structure over time. They never talked about solutions. They talked about survival. Tradition told my father to endure. Society told him to provide. Culture told him to stay silent. But none of those voices told him how to heal, how to connect, or how to be happy. And over time, the silence he lived in became suffocating. Meanwhile, the world outside kept changing. People began talking about mental health. Gender roles shifted. Expectations were questioned. But my father stayed anchored in the old world, resisting the tide pulling everyone forward. He wasn't stubborn, he was scared. The world he knew didn't prepare him for a world where men admitted their fears. He carried unspoken disappointments about his job, his income, his past decisions. Each disappointment settled on him like dust he never brushed off. Over time, those layers of dust became a weight too heavy to carry, even for a man convinced he was supposed to be unbreakable. Inside the structure of our family, the pressure built slowly. The silence became louder. The distance between him and us grew wider. We sensed the shift, but didn't know how to bridge the gap. How do you reach someone who doesn't believe he deserves to be understood? His goodbye, when it finally came, was not spontaneous. It was the final collapse of years of unprocessed emotions and unmet expectations. A collapse shaped by a cultural blueprint that told him to endure instead of express, to perform rather than connect, to stay silent instead of seek help. He didn't leave because he didn't love us. He left because he no longer knew how to carry the life he built. He had been walking on emotional cracks for years, and the goodbye was simply the moment the ground finally gave way. Looking back, I see how his pride fought with his pain, how his fear wrestled with his responsibilities, how every choice he made was tangled in the expectations of generations before him. Expectations that taught him to sacrifice everything, even himself, before ever admitting he needed help. The tragedy is that he didn't know another way. No one taught him emotional literacy. No one taught him that strength and vulnerability can coexist. No one told him that opening up doesn't make you less of a man, it makes you more human. The weight of financial struggle, cultural duty, and emotional restraint fused into a kind of pressure no one could withstand forever. By the time he said goodbye, he was already hollowed out by years of silent suffering. The goodbye wasn't the beginning of his departure. It was the conclusion. And the older I grow, the more I see that his leaving wasn't a single choice. It was a series of impossible expectations crushing a man who never learned how to ask for air. His goodbye became the final chapter of a story written by history, culture, silence, fear, and the invisible battles he fought alone. A collapse that had been building long before any of us realized the foundation was cracking beneath him. And though it hurt, though it reshaped my life, I now understand this. My father didn't walk away from us. He walked away from the weight he could no longer carry.